Um, there we go. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to our February think tank call. I wanted to take just a second. We haven't done this in the past, but I wanted to start doing this. I wanted to give it just a second. This think tank call is continuing to expand and it's open to basically, just for clarity, we really try to create a little bit of a boundary where everyone on the call typically is what we would loosely call an executive level church leader or nonprofit leader. It's not that we're opposed to people doing student ministry, et cetera, but we really feel like this call is for people that are at some proximity to the decision making table. And mostly because most of our conversations are lend themselves
Mhm.
to that. And so this monthly call. If you're on the call or you're on the list, if somehow you ended up invited to the call by someone and you're not technically on the calendar list or not technically in our database, love for you to add yourself. Someone from our team, which I'll introduce, will drop it in the chat. The reason is because you're going to get the email with the follow up. So if you're not in our system, you're not going to get the recording of the call or the deck we do today. So if somehow you got in through a side door, great. Love that you're here, but make sure that you get officially, if Brandon or Aaron or somebody can drop the think tank sign up form in the chat. That'll also assure you that you'll get the invites going forward for all the monthly calls and you won't miss out. Cool. All right. Okay, for the next slide, this is just a quick reminder. We do this every month. There's details that'll start to come out, but I wanted you guys to just go into your calendar right now and block these 3 days, 2 nights, 3 days, in mid to late October. The weather will be great. Is this our fifth K or sixth? Fifth, something like, I think it's six, five. This is our fifth Think Tank Live that really is a live 3 day experience that sort of mimics not only what we do on these calls, but also allows you guys to network, meet each other in person, all that. And a lot of guys actually will bring, like, say you're a lead guy and you've got an executive or two, they'll actually come as a team to that. Again, it's not the Think Tank Live, similar to our calls, is not designed for everybody on your team. But if your executive team comes, it's a great chance to work through some of that while also dealing with a little bit of stuff that's really viable to all of your team and valuable for your team. So just mark those dates. We typically after Easter will roll out the actual registration for that. Okay, cool. All right, let's roll. Oh, free cigars. Okay, great, Caleb. If you're a cigar person, there you go. All right. One of the things we want to do today is deep dive, and I'm going to ask our team. So Kay is going to jump in with me on this. The other Growmentum teams guys are on here, and some of you may not know them. So Aaron's over there on his couch. Brennan's also on his couch. Brandon is there. I think I saw Snod coming in hot from Anaheim. Derek is here from his home office, and I think Matt is also on here as well. So those guys will be in the chat. We'll also unmute, but love having you guys be able to interact with them as well. Part of it is this call is designed to be our work on it moment. So most of you probably were working in it today, potentially. Maybe you weren't, but you ended whatever work you were doing in it to get on this call. And so our objective is for the next 45 minutes to give you some constructs and some direction around working on it. Our hope is to make it both a little bit of a webinar every time we're together, but also a little bit of a conversation, so that conversation can happen in the chat. But hey, if you want to just unmute and ask a question or whatever, it will not bother us at all. We would actually enjoy that. So here we go. All right. So last month, if you guys were here, if you weren't, go back and grab it. We talked a lot about organizational empathy. I think McKenna is on this call from New North, and they actually ran a little bit of that exercise with their team. We really focused on understanding each other as a team, some of the some exercises that you can do to help your team understand each other's needs, wants, all those kind of things. And then Kay and I have been talking a little bit about this whole journey today that we want to take you guys on that really has to do specifically with engagement, what we're calling engagement empathy. You guys remember COVID? Remember COVID? Raise your hand if you remember and miss COVID. You remember in COVID, it became very popular to um, talk about the idea that engagement is the new attendance, and we're all about engagement. People can't show up, so we're engaging. And then what happens is that when we get out of that, we sometimes forget some of the best practices that we learned from that. So today we want to talk a little bit more about that. Some of you may be more comfortable if you at least can, if you feel a little more comfortable. We always try to partner a little bit the idea of engagement is for the purpose of discipleship. So if you're thinking about, well, what's discipleship? When we use the terminology engagement, we're really sort of subtly saying, how are we engaging people to a life on mission, being a church on mission towards discipleship? So I may not say discipleship, may not sound super spiritual, but that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about means and methods of engagement. Okay. Kay, I don't even remember what's on the next slide, so I'm going to just have you push forward. Okay, so let's run these real quick. So these are the three, the two on the ends we talked about to some extent last call in January. But I love kind of this idea of this picture, and maybe some of you do as well. Is kind of the idea of like, what does empathy look like to the understanding what's going on in our communities? In a sense, the evangelistic empathy. Do we understand the people that our church has the opportunity to reach? Then secondarily, what we're going to talk about today, do we understand the people in our church that we're trying to engage in discipleship? And then thirdly, do we understand our team and our staff and what we're trying to do? And it's just been a theme over the last few months for us as a Grow Momentum team. Like, how does empathy play a role in that? And you've seen it on our Instagram and our social. Like, what does that look like? And how do we become more empathetic leaders? I don't know how you guys feel, but I think after years of ministry, I think empathy leaks a little bit. I think that we can tend to be less empathetic the longer we're doing ministry, and we get a little beat up by people's lives and we get burned. And so sometimes we can be a little less empathetic than we need to be. So today we want to talk about engagement, empathy. Let's go forward, Kate. There it is. Keep going. Ba, ba, ba. All right. So we sent out a Chick-fil-A card today, but part of why we did that, and maybe Kay will hit this first before we get into the Chick-fil-A illustration, is because we're actually going to talk about Chick-fil-A today. So if you grabbed a sandwich, good for you. All right. There's still some dollars on there. So if you haven't had lunch yet, the sandwich is on us. Yeah, you want to talk about the conversations you've been having? I think it would be helpful as far as context before we jump into the Chick-fil-A thing.
Yeah, for sure. One of the different things that we've been talking with church leaders as we've been working with them, and specifically the thought leader concept of the simple church was something that came out like in 2000s, right? Like 2006, I think. A book was written by Tom Rainier and a couple of other Eric Geiger, I think, right? So simple church. It inspired so many churches to adopt this simple church model, streamlining ministries, reducing sideways energy, focusing on clear engagement processes. And what's interesting is that by eliminating this clutter of programming, churches started to produce alignment, better focus with staff resources, volunteer resources. They even created like this straightforward pathway for people to connect, grow, and serve. And so, because and as a result of that, they said a lot of no's to a lot of different opportunities that didn't align to the core vision. So it became easier to protect the church from mission overload and ensuring like the clarity of the purpose of where we are going. But what's interesting as we've been having more and more conversations around people that have been thinking around this, over time, an unintended tension had merged because simplicity was there to be able to improve focus, but it also potentially restricted opportunities for engagement. And so it actually left a lot of people feeling disconnected or underserved. I don't know if you've heard this in your churches, but when you have fewer ministry opportunities or offerings, certain needs go unmet. People seek other opportunities in other communities to be able to fill that. And so then now we're all struggling with how do we retain the strategic clarity of a simple church model while responding to the growing desires and needs of people who want to get engaged. So I mean, the things that we've heard is how many moms have come to you and said, "Hey, we want to start a mom's ministry, but we've said no because it doesn't fit our strategy around groups,"
Mhm.
right? How about, like you've noticed people leaving the church for other offerings and other diverse ministry offerings, but you know that those churches don't have the clarity that you've worked so hard to be able to strategically align, right? Or, your outreach efforts or your volunteers, all those type of things. And so as we were just kind of navigating this conversation, without abandoning simplicity, without abandoning strategy and alignment, how
Mhm.
can we think and not say no to everything? But what can we potentially say yes to? And so we've been talking about this framework that we're about to introduce now.
Hey, is that like a frustration that you're feeling, and maybe some of you on the call are feeling? Because we've always sort of taken that, and even some of our tools where we talk a lot about ROI, and all of that, and how we leverage that. What's that conversation like for you, Kay? Because I know you're having them. Like, what are they asking? Should we start
Mhm.
doing this stuff again? Is that it, or is it more strategic than that?
Right. I think there was just this default mode that we all got into to be able to say, no, we don't do that. No, we don't do that. No, we don't do that.
Mhm.
And we only do groups and we only do groups this way. And so if you're not going to get into a group, then that's our way to be able to spiritually grow, or that's our only way to be able to find community. And all of us, I mean, like especially here at the Gramentum, we are so much about alignment and strategy and about making sure that we don't have sideways energy. So all of that jives with us. At the same time, are we losing something on the table with people who need to get engaged in different ways that potentially could be on ramps that could potentially be part of our process or pipelines
Mm.
towards certain things that we value?
I think that we would also use that tension of like the Vegas term we've used with some of you when we've been with your teams is that buffet idea, right? It's like we worked really hard. We did that here at the crossing where I sit today,
That's right.
really hard to like eliminate as much of the buffet as possible. And I think the metaphor still applies, right? Because we don't want to be doing, I think the strategy is still actually probably the best way to lean in the tension. But I love what Kay just said, where it's like sometimes the strategy can lend us to just say no to everything almost out of default or out of like, I don't know, instinct. Kay, is that what you're saying? Like it just becomes like we're
Yeah.
not even considering it.
Yeah, exactly. Like we've literally taken in some cases where we're talking to leaders, we've taken the buffet model and we don't like that model. And we've now swung the pendulum all the way to the other side where even though we all say, hey, in and out is the way to go, in and out is like the simplified cheeseburger, hamburger,
This is
animal
a Chick
fries,
fil A
type
call.
of
This
thing.
is not an In
Okay,
and Out
got it,
call. Chick
got it.
fil A call.
So we'll say that. But at the same time, if that analogy, if we were to just extrapolate that, we don't eat in and out every day. Hopefully you don't. That's not a balanced diet. That's not what, every, like if you only had Chick-fil-A as your only offering, or in and out. And so what does it look like to be able to, have a secret menu, or what is it like to be able to expand that offering that could be romance? So all that to say, this is the tee up
Yeah.
conversation for Lee to be able to help navigate this conversation around a framework that we've developed.
And I think this framework will help you with that. And I wanted Kay to tee it up because I don't want this, I didn't want this conversation to be framed in a should we kill things framework. Maybe you should. That's a great conversation. This is not the conversation we're necessarily having today, though it may eventually lead to that. This is more of of what we're going to be calling an empathetic engagement conversation. So, in the midst of all of this conversation that our team was having, one of the things that was interesting is I was in a meeting here at the crossing with our directional team, our lead team. It would be maybe in some of your context, your department heads. And in the middle of the meeting, posed a question. Someone posed a question, and they wrote it on the wall. And we were going to spend some time unpacking it. I'm going to paraphrase the question because it's their question was way better than what I'm saying, but it's the heart of the question. The question basically was, why are more people not doing our crap? That was the question. They didn't word it that way, but that's basically what the question was: is we are frustrated because we're offering all these things and people are not engaging at the levels we want them to. And so we proceeded to have a conversation that populated a very long list. You've probably done this. We've done it with churches, right? It's kind of that idea of like, what are people's lives like? What do they care about? Why are, and so we wrote things like they don't have margin. They're moving too fast. There's no pace, blah, blah, blah. We wrote all those things, and those things were true. But at the end of the day, we walked out of the meeting, and I felt like about an hour later that it was a very anemic empathy meeting. In other words, we wrote the list as if what is wrong with these people versus what potentially is wrong with what we're doing. And we needed to have a more empathetic posture to understand where people were that maybe would dictate what is happening with the things that we believe. Sometimes the things in the church, guys, that we can be guilty of is we have this knee-jerk reaction, and we're allowed to spiritualize things that are not neatly spiritual. In other words, it's easy for us to say, why aren't people doing what we want them to do? It's so biblical. It's so amazing for them. It's so transformative. Why wouldn't they do this, right? And so we can just over spiritualize something to the point where we lose sight of the real mechanics of the practicality of people's lives and the empathetic nature of how they exist. So I was in the midst of this. I went to Chick-fil-A. I don't regularly go there, but my wife has gotten addicted to those slimy the grilled chicken little bites. They look like dog food. There's like 12 of them in a bowl, and she gets them. And I'm like, this, if you're gonna go to Chick-fil-A, just get the spicy chicken. I mean, what are we even doing? But anyway, she sent me. So I go there, and I become infatuated because I'm a weird dude with what's happening in the line. Because you guys have all gone to Chick-fil-A. We have a new one that's about 4 miles from our house. So this is like state of the art Chick-fil-A. And I'm infatuated by what's happening. And so after I go through the line and I get her chicken bites and her fruit bowl, I go home and I Google Chick-fil-A drive-through. And what I deep dove into is so relevant to the conversation we're having today, because the Wall Street Journal just came out with an article literally last week. It's probably behind a firewall, but maybe some of you can figure it out. Okay, I'll hack you into it. But it talks about like what they did. And basically what they did is they knew they had a problem at their drive-throughs. And so they flew drones over their busiest Chick-fil-A's to watch the traffic flow and to watch the flow of what people did. And what they discovered was there was a point where people would stop, would get out of line, or would turn around and not get in line. And what that did. And so they began to do an overhaul of the drive-through experience at Chick-fil-A, to which all of us probably, if we've been to Chick-fil-A in the last 6 months, have probably experienced. And what they did is, and we're going to dive deeper into this in a moment, is they basically identified and tried to eliminate or at least lower what they would call high friction points. Okay. And so let me identify three things that they did. I think it's on the slide, Kay, that they actually did around friction. And it really was three essential things that they did. And you're going to see how this relates to engagement in just a moment. So first of all, when you go to Chick-fil-A now, if go back 1K, if you go to Chick-fil-A now, they actually, if you realize, they actually take your order way out in the line. All of you have experienced that, right? You rarely, unless you're there on a very slow day, will you actually pull up to the speaker. You will actually be greeted by a 16-year-old high school kid with an iPad who will take your order, right? And what they did was they actually recognized that there were wins in this. And the wins in this were the following. Couple things. Number one is, what's going on with the slide thing? It keeps going forward. I'm gonna have to take over. What they did was, oh, sorry, bro. They went in and they went, okay, can we move the first point of contact for people in the drive-through line as further out? And so they started moving that first point of contact further out in the line. So you're not in line as long. Then the second thing they did is they recognized that people would have decision anxiety when they pulled up to the speaker and the menu, and they had less of that when they were actually talking to someone face to face, and the orders were more accurate. So they addressed the decision friction by moving people out. The other thing that happened was they're able to control pace of the line because they can add more staff at heavier times. So they don't just have to add more lanes because there's a limit to that physically with the property. They can just add more staff and extend it out. Okay. The second point of friction they addressed with that is now they've created a timing sync that's way better, because now you order way earlier. And by the time you get to the point where your food is ready and they hand you the bag, the food is typically ready, or there's just a brief pause. And so what it's allowed is for the kitchen to actually prepare the food versus you ordering and then sitting at the window, i.e. a Taco Bell, where you sit there and you wait for them to make your chalupa, and you sit for 4 minutes and everybody else in line is waiting as well. The last one is the one I love, and then I'll pause and let people give feedback. I don't know what a Portillo's is, Caleb, but it can't be better than Chick-fil-A. All right. Don't let him unmute. Do not let him unmute. Okay. Is the progress one. This is the one that blew my mind a little bit. Is when you go in the line at Chick-fil-A, they take your order and then they have you pull forward and do what? So Johnny takes your order and then Sarah takes your money or swipes your card, and then you move forward. And what they've learned is that their drive-through probably is not even their drive-through is not any more efficient than a Taco Bell, but because you're moving, it eliminates friction mentally for you as a customer, and you will stay in line and you think that it's actually a quicker experience than it is because you're moving. So they've put those strategic movements in place to eliminate some of that friction that you might be experiencing. What does this have? What does this have to do with us? Everything. To Kay's point he just made 5 minutes ago is when we think about creating ministry, when we think about increasing engagement, we have to ask the question that we're actually framing with these two words. What is the level of desire versus what is the level of friction that exists when it comes to points of engagement and discipleship in our church community? So the formula looks something like this. It would be like, we should be asking the question that, like, if I want a chicken sandwich, great. But there is a point where the challenge to get the chicken sandwich is so great that my desire is gone because the friction is so great. So the formula works something like this. We should raise desire as much as possible. And we'll talk about what that looks like here. And we should lower and or eliminate as much friction as is reasonable and healthy to actually create greater engagement with our people. And so that's what we want to talk about for the rest of the call today. So let's give some definitions, and then we might pause here for a second and allow for some feedback. The way we're defining desire is, what is the perceived worth or value or benefit and the level of enthusiasm that people have around a particular engagement opportunity. Let's pick on small groups for example, because most of us have some form of small group, life group, connection group. You would ask the question, what desire is there for that? The other way to phrase it might be, do people understand the why, which should raise desire, and do they understand the when behind it? That would be the desire definition, okay? Balanced against the friction is, what is the perceived cost? What is the perceived time that it's going to take? What is the perceived, next slide, Kate. What is the perceived, like, I don't know, effort that I have to make, right? To make this actually something that I want to be a part of, okay? So for you and I, leading our churches, we care about people living a life on mission, connecting with Christ. I think it's a worthwhile conversation, whether we're simple or not, to go, how are we doing at elevating desire by being clear and communicating the holistic thing that is beneficial and spiritually dynamic for people? And how do we do our best to lower appropriately the level of friction that people might be experiencing? I'm going to stop for a second and allow either some of our guys or some of you to make comment or ask questions. Feel free to unmute, and then we'll jump into our 2x2. Don't all unmute at once. It'll get awkward.
All right, I'll jump in. And so what's the best way to gather that, I guess, information or data with desire, friction, because I'm not a big fan of surveys, but
right.
Yeah, love to ask.
We can talk about surveys. Okay, that might be an interesting conversation to have on one of these calls, because we do have some best practices around that, Jeremy. But I think partly what we're going to do next will help with that a little bit. Unfortunately, I think it's part data, but I think it's also part assessment that your team needs to do as you look at either preemptively or post-mortem on the initiatives that you're taking on, right? That we're having some clear conversations. Okay.
Well, the point that I want to just make is that the surveys are usually more for quantitative results, and focus groups are more quantitative results, or no, quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative, yeah, there you go.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I would we've seen effective is the focus groups around, let's say, for example, people who have don't have that desire to be able to get into something that we've been pimping or we've been announcing or be marketing, right? So the interesting thing about this is that when we actually evaluate desire, sometimes the desire is not as high as we want it to be around something that we are excited about, or maybe some of your staff might actually admit and say, we are actually manufacturing our desire around something that we have as a program that our people are not excited about and I'm not excited about, but I'm manufacturing the energy and the desire to be able to make sure that we're marketing or getting people towards that event. And so this is an evaluation towards that. So all that to say, I would say it's definitely one-on-one conversations. It's definitely focus groups. It's definitely hearing, hey, trusted people that you have relationships to be able to say, we've got this set event, we got this set program or ministry. Tell me a little bit about why that doesn't engage you or why your desire is not, high on that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I think sometimes it's difficult for our team. So I love you bringing that up, Bosma. It's difficult for our team to assess this. Because we're going to show you a little tool that can help spur the conversation. But I think again, we're unfortunately we're going to default to our thing is great. I don't understand people, which lends itself back to the empathy question, right? It's like, well, your thing might be great, but the reality is people's behaviors trumps your thing being great. And it may be great, but it's not, it's like we have as they say, the ball don't lie, right? Like if people aren't in it, then we've got to do some work there. Any other thoughts before we get into the actual construct that'll help us assess this a bit? This friction conversation actually is also probably could leak into your your outward focused stuff as well. Because obviously, if those of you on the call that are where we're very Sunday centric in our worship gatherings, this obviously speaks into that for sure, especially if we're talking about guest experience, et cetera, right? Like how much friction versus if they really want to be here on a Sunday and experience one of our services, how much friction is there to actually make that possible? All of that's going on. So we think the world is run by good 2x2. So we all love 2x2s on our team. So, okay, let's start with the 2x2. So here's the 2x2. All right. And it basically is taking desire and friction and slamming them onto this grid. And this is the evaluation, to your point, Bosma, that I would invite your team to think about when it comes to, let's say, small group engagement, or maybe some of your pathway next steps. Maybe you get in connect cards like crazy, but people aren't taking your next step. I would ask you to start thinking about what do we believe is the level of desire? This is a hard one. So again, Kay, unmute if you, this may be a harder one to actually give an attribute to as far as low versus high. Some of it is probably the data, right? Because if desire is high, people are going to find a way to get to something. But I think you got to ask that question versus how much friction exists, right? Is it a low versus high friction experience? So when Tony's in downtown Seattle and he's trying to plant a church down there, there's probably a lot of friction points for Tony that maybe don't exist in Bellevue, right, where Micah is. There's things about I'm downtown. People don't have kids. They don't live downtown with kids as much, blah, 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 right? And so if he's doing ministry and he's like, man, people should love this, he may be neglecting the friction points that exist demographically where he is. So let's go through the 4 quadrants. We'll start on the first one. And I'm not going to go through all of these line by line because I think we can have conversation. But if something is low desire and low friction and people are not engaging in it, we would say that there's an apathetic posture towards it. that their engagement is apathetic. In other words, it would be reflected in low enthusiasm. Anybody have any examples of that? You can give examples from somebody else's church that's on the call. What would be typically potentially a low desire, low friction point? Anybody? What might slip into there easily? I'm sure no one has it. Somebody?
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Going
Derek
to
Beaucamp.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think an easy one for a lot of us is whatever your equivalent of your men's breakfast is or whatever. Like it happens. It's a thing. You can show up. If people want to be there or not, it's hard to say. We don't really maybe create much excitement around it. There's not much to do in getting there. It's like, it is what it is, I think is what I've found myself saying, and maybe other people with those kind of environments.
I love that because like in our context, we have a men's gathering, a men's breakfast. Our biggest problem is there's about 30 guys that desire it, and they're all 55 years old. And so anybody where we want our median age to drive down, they have absolutely no desire, or to Derek's point, their kids have soccer games every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. And then they run their other kid to gymnastics, and then they have a date one night with their wife. And so the way that we structure that men's breakfast doesn't even connect. There's so many friction points for them. It's crazy, right? And so that would lend itself to the other category. That was a segue. Do you guys see what I did there? Which would be low desire, high friction, which would be I avoid it. So I'm 30-year-old guy with 2 small kids. You've got a men's breakfast. I'm not that excited about it. I don't really know anybody at it. And I'm pretty lowly. There's pretty low motivation for me to show up based on all the hoops that I have to jump through to get there. By the way, don't forget this friction point. And somebody type this in the chat. One of the friction points we often overlook is prior experience. In other words, if I've gone to something and it was less than stellar, or we didn't deliver on what we said was going to be the point of, hey, show up for this thing. It's awesome. We're all like selling it, and they show up and it's poorly run. It doesn't meet the objective. That becomes a friction point the next time that we invite somebody to that environment or to take. Small groups are classic for that, right? Man, everybody should be in a small group, connect with people. And so that person goes to that first small group experience and it's a train wreck. And so the next time Jeremiah stands on stage and goes, we're launching 8 weeks of small group, that person in their brain is thinking that time they walked into that living room and the dog jumped on them and they're allergic to cats and the cat was there and the food was horrific and there was a bunch of strange conversation. And so Jeremiah's going, small groups are great. And they're going, not so much. And so we have to be careful and understand that prior experience is also a friction point that will lead to avoidance. This is the funky category, the next one. The upper right, and we chose this word and we wrestled with it, but we think it's the right word and we're sticking with it, not only because it starts with A, but because it really is appropriate, because you think about a decision you make that you agonize over. Kyle, that's a good point, actually. So prior positive experiences, he's in the chat, sorry, he just caught my attention, can actually work the other way. So I appreciate you pointing that out. So when they have good experiences, it actually can lower friction for the next time. So they work, if that's what you're alluding to, Kyle, they work in both ways. The agonize word actually can be a positive word, by the way. There are certain things we want people to agonize over. Like, man, we want them to process. Some of you do high discipleship environments. You might do an alpha or a rooted or something like that. And there's a high level of investment in that. And so it's okay for there to be a reasonable amount of friction there. We just have to be comfortable with what sits in this quadrant. Let me say that again. You need to be comfortable that nothing inappropriate sits in this agonizing quadrant. So for example, your first step on a pathway for a guest should not sit in this quadrant. If your first step is 4 weeks, 2 hours on a Wednesday night, and that's where we invite all our guests, I would argue that you have made that a high friction, even if people want to, right? It's so high friction that they're going to agonize over whether they can do that or not. There's a lot of other environments that fit into this as well. Um, some levels of leadership in your church. You want like elders, etc., maybe leading teams. You want there to be a certain level, even like children's workers, right? They're in the children's team. You gotta get a background check. You got to go to training. Those are appropriate levels of friction. I was listening to a podcast last week. Simon Sinek. This would be a great podcast for you guys to listen to. Somebody could look it up and drop it in the chat. It was Sinek. I think Derek has it. It was Simon Sinek, who I love, talking to the Airbnb CEO. And at one point in the conversation, the Airbnb CEO actually spoke into what we're talking about without knowing it. He said, friction points can either be constraints or guardrails. And I stopped what I was doing and I wrote it down because I thought that's powerful, because some friction points are actually appropriate guardrails, i.e., we don't want everybody working in the children's ministry that shouldn't be there. So it's okay to have guardrails. I think guardrails as friction points are helpful. Constraints are probably not as helpful.
The other thing that friction will do is that there's certain things that you want the bar to be higher, not only for guardrails and protection, but also expectations and engagement. So if you have something from a leadership perspective, or we used to do something called leader development groups, and so we actually had a high bar of expectation where we saw potential in people to be able to invite them into these groups. They were actually invited into those groups, and so because of that, they had an expectation they could only miss 2 meetings, right? That's high friction, right? With the amount of people travel and all that stuff. But we did that on purpose because we wanted a certain output and we wanted a certain engagement level. And so all that to say, high friction is not necessarily bad, right? It's just you got to be, and then it's what Lee said, making sure that your first steps don't have that. Now, the lower the friction, the other principle applies to it as well. The lower the friction, many times there's a lack of engagement on the other side too, right? So, and that might be okay because you're trying to get them to at least take one step to be able to take further steps. But just know that that lever or that mechanism in which you go back and forth around that, so some people, we've had conversations around this with churches. Where do you put your first step? Do you give them a little bit of friction so that when they're there, they're serious about actually taking that next step? Or do you make it so easy for them to come in so that they become more of a lead generator towards the next steps? It depends on your philosophy. It depends on where you want and where your gap is.
Yeah, I think that's a point well spoken. Because again, we're not trying to dictate what should have friction or not. I think we have some strong opinions. Like Kay just said, your first step should not be in this quadrant. But at the end of the day, I think the value, almost to what Bosma said earlier, is you need to be having this conversation with your team. Like everything you're doing that is driving engagement, we should be asking the question, how are we increasing desire, and how are we lowering unnecessary friction, and how are we setting a bar of appropriate friction that matches with that environment? And if you have a frustrated team member, I would be having this conversation. If they're doing things and they're always frustrated, why is no one doing our crap? The question we started this whole call with. I would sit them down and put this on the board and go, let's talk about it. Because it's either a lack of desire or it's either a desire or a friction issue, and we've got to figure it out. Any other comments? We'll get the last one up here. The chat's great today. If you're not in the chat, take a look. There's some good nuggets in the chat and some resources as well. The last one's pretty obvious. It's just the high desire, low friction. This is the access quadrant. This is where high engagement happens. Please don't take this as I got to go back to my team and drive everything into this quadrant. I think you're picking up on that. That's not the objective. But I think understanding that we do want as many things as possible to live at least somewhere in, even if it's to the right in this quadrant, to be as highly accessible as possible to drive engagement. I do think as we get deeper on pipelines, so if you've been around Growmentum forever, and Brandon's an expert in pipelines, but if you get around pipelines and you get deeper into them, one of the things that happens is the further right you get in most pipelines, say giving, right? The further right you get in giving, from a charitable giver to like an above and beyond legacy giver, probably the greater it moves into the agonized box, right? It's just a little bit more friction there, a little more sacrifice, a little more of that goes on. And so I think typically as you move deeper into the pipelines, the friction level is appropriately going to increase because it also serves as guardrails. Okay, open forum, unmute, feedback. You don't even have to be a question, just feedback. Help us, give us your input to help everybody else on the call in the last 6 minutes gain better perspective. What are you thinking as you listen? What's resonating with you? What questions do you have?
Oh, that's the spot right there.
Going once, going twice.
Well, hey, I'll jump in. Lee.
Who's that?
Kyle.
Kyle. Welcome, brother.
I love this. I like to say that prescription without diagnosis is malpractice, and it's always important to diagnose what's needed for the people that we're called to lead and serve. And so I love this tool because it really clarifies, maybe I want to have some things that are high access, low friction, and other things. Am I upside down? Oh, cool. What if I did this? How about that? Did that do anything? Still upside down? I'm about to climb on my head. Look at this.
It's okay. Now we can see your face, so that's nice. But it's sideways. Oh, there we go.
What the heck? Well, anyway, how about this? I'll just turn my camera off. I just love the tool and the ease of using this. So thanks. Good job. Way to go.
Yeah, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was saying, Joel, you're out in Wabash, which is rural, right? Some guys can relate to that. I don't want to put you on the spot, but when you think about desire friction, how does it work uniquely in a rural setting? Because some of these guys are very urban and there's different friction points. What does that look like for you? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm processing through the different environments and kind of where they would fall on this 2x2, and understanding we've got a very multi-generational culture. You've got kids, parents, grandparents, great grandparents in the same community, and so family is central to everything. And so there are certain days of the week and times that are just going to be off limits because it's family time. And so looking at ways, how can we lower, at least in our context, what are those opportunities we have to lower friction? Because we kind of bang our head against the wall too, and we look at, man, we think this thing's great, but nobody's coming to it. So
right.
It's a lot to chew on.
One of the things that I'm thinking about is that it might not be even the actual program that is a high desire or low desire.
Okay, come on.
It's the way that actually we market it, or we actually advertise it. So, for example, I'll give you an example around small groups. Because we get to work with churches across the nation, there are certain churches that really, small group, community is the felt need, is the desire that they're trying to drive people towards. Hey, you need a community and we want you to get in a small group because of that. And so because of that high desire, people get into small groups. But in other places, actually, they feel like they got enough friends. The community is not actually what they need. Spiritual growth is actually the felt need for small groups. And so that desire is actually what gets people into small groups more than the felt need of community. And so to be able to really do a deep dive in understanding what are the desires of your community, what are the values of your community, and then being able to match that with the things that you have, you're still offering small groups, but the desire of how you communicate that might be different.
Gold. Seriously, gold. Okay, do you want to speak to the question around what would be the best way to maybe work through this? Like everybody gets this and now they're all of a sudden like, hey, I'm going to get my team in the room right now. You want to, you're great at facilitating these things. How would you go approach it?
Well, I mean, the thing that we always say about these 2x2s is that once you see all the answers in the boxes, it kind of spoils you, right? And so you as a facilitator can really do this with your team or with different people without the names, without the boxes, right? Because ultimately it's an independent conversation. Whatever said opportunity, event, program, ministry, whatever you're evaluating, isolate it. What's the desire point? Okay. Oh man, it's high, it's low, right? And to be able to plot it on the high or low chart. Then independently have the friction conversation and say, okay, what's the friction to be able to get into that said program or said event, and then be able to do that. So isolating those is the most important thing, and then putting it on there because we get really biased as far as like, no, we don't want to put it in the avoid box. We don't want to put it in this.
Once
And
they
so it's
know it's there. Yeah.
yeah, right. And so that and again, we do think that, there's certain seasons where certain events or certain things there will be a high desire and others there will be a low desire. Um, the other thing that I was thinking about, if as far as the friction point goes, or even this whole exercise, is I love that Chick-fil-A would actually take something like this and say, okay, hey, we're going to revamp our entire drive-through experience. And some of you, that might be your takeaway, that you're going to actually take away and walk and say, all right, what are we doing from a parking lot perspective, from a welcoming perspective, from a check-in perspective, from a tracking experience? How can we reduce friction so that people can actually, feel more welcome, whatever. That might be your, so it could
Right.
be used in a like a 10,000 foot to 0,000 foot level. But don't forget the higher level conversations, the 20 to 30,000 foot level conversations that we're having about ministry strategy and how the friction point affects that too.
Mm. I wonder, I do think there is a correlation. These are not the same conversations, but I do think part of where I would coach some of you guys who are familiar, like with the ROI tool, where you evaluate things as far as what's the time, energy, attention, money versus impact. And I think where I might use this tool is, let's say you're looking at your year ahead and you run the ROI tool and you go, there's these four things. There's a Christmas event that we do. There's this, there's 4 or 5 things that you just highlight as like, we need to have conversations around them. That might be then the cue to go, okay, let's bring those 5 core elements that there's some level of frustration or some level of underperforming, and let's lay them against this and try to start to do a little bit of a dissection around why that underperforming might be happening. That would be important. Brian, to your question, and I'll let other people go. I think I would get him. I would get buy-in, Brian. In other words, I would sit with him and help him understand the tool and sort of get buy-in so he's not sideswiped. Brian asked the question, how do I lead it? How do I lead in this conversation with the lead pastor prior to the team conversation? And I think it's simple, but it's not simple, but it's him understanding and making sure he doesn't walk in. You've got to understand, um, you want to carefully lead him, right? Being subversive, submissive. And what you don't want is all of his stuff ending up in apathy and on the lower left. So you got to figure out, how do I understand where he is on these things and help him see the value of the tool. But yeah, you definitely don't want a side swipe happening. Nobody likes that. Somebody had said something else in the chat. About expectation. Yeah, I think that's a great question, Kyle. I think that goes to the desire and expectation. But I would argue, Kyle, I think we just have to hold that really loosely because I think at some point we have limited bandwidth, right? So if everything's happening, we can say everything is valuable. And you know this as a leader. And I think at some point we have to be okay saying that's really valuable. It's just not for us valuable, right? That's that whole idea of unique UI. What is our unique identity? Why do we uniquely exist in the community? What is our competitive uniqueness? And I think that's a filter as well for when we start asking the question, why is there low desire? It may be because it's not within our value system and we're trying to do something that again, I would point at Tony in downtown Seattle. There may be things that suburban Seattleites love that downtown Seattle is not going to go for. And I think he can talk till he's blue in the face of how great it is and how much they should love it. But there's just a disconnect. We got a minute or two. Anybody on our team want to give any closing thoughts or comments as you've been patiently waiting and working the chat like crazy before we sign off?
I mean, the only encouragement I'd say is don't be afraid to call a spade a spade with your team. I think sometimes we get so afraid that we want to, name a thing. Like, for example, like groups. Some people are like, well, groups need to be for this purpose. But if groups in your church are meant for a community, it's okay. And what happens is when you misname what groups are, you're going to have more friction points of getting people into them.
So good.
And so that's why it's just call the spade a spade, and then you'll be more honest with where it's at here, so you can identify friction points.
That's good. We're having an egg and milk conversation in the chat. You don't want to miss it. Awesome. So we're gonna wrap. I'm gonna have Derek pray for us at the end of the call, because I'm not being flippant. Like, we really do need to enter these conversations prayerfully. One, because these are important conversations around what we're driving people towards. But two, there is a level of investment, et cetera, that our team has around these things. And we want God to be involved in the conversations as we place in there. So I'm going to have Derek kind of pray us out, and then we'll close out the call and get you guys off to Chick-fil-A. I think Derek's still on the call. Maybe he's not. Maybe I just called him out and he's not even here. Becker, are you eating Chick-fil-A right now? Excellent. All right, Jeff, pray us out, bro.
Yeah, Jesus, thanks for the conversation. Thanks for the space that we get to have as leaders to be able to come together, to be sharpened by each other. I pray, God, that as we wrestle with this truth, this reality, this exercise, may it make our churches better so that we can be more effective at reaching people for you. That's what matters most. May we not lose sight of that. May we be encouraged that we're in the midst of community that are struggling with very similar things, so that we can be better men and women as we reach people for you. God, we love you and praise you. In your name we pray. Amen.